Crazy mother-in-law and father-in-law arrested after attempting to trespass on our land and being attacked by bees on the neighbor's property. I reside in a very rural place on a tiny ranch that has been in my family since my grandfather's day. We are around 15 minutes from the nearest little town. When I say small, I actually mean small. My wife and I met by happenstance around 6 years ago when I stopped in town to pick up some groceries. She gave off a tomboy feeling and had recently arrived in the region. She had recently finished school and discovered that she despised city life and wished to return to something more familiar. I will get to that later. I believe she noticed me come in with my pickup and some big equipment and came over to ask what kind of animals I had. She soon came to the point. She was looking for work. She had previous experience with cattle and was new to the region. It's unusual in our area to see single women looking for ranch hand employment, but she claimed she could prove herself, and if I wasn't impressed, I could drive her back to town and drop her off at the bus stop. I was seeking an extra hand for the next few months and had considered asking my neighbor's lads, but I decided to give her a chance. I'm pleased I did, since she had a strong work ethic and was proactive about everything on the ranch. I let her remain in a guest room in the main home for the first week until she saved enough money for an apartment. Within 6 months she moved back in and we began dating. 8 months later, we married in a quiet ceremony attended by approximately 20 friends and family members. Her uncle was the only family member that turned up. Her uncle was a tank of a man, even in his old age, and he had a sheep farm in Northern California. During the ceremony, we talked a little about business, and he was pleased to give my wife away. I could tell how the father influenced her work ethic and livestock knowledge. However, there was one topic that my wife disliked discussing: her biological parents. At first, she only mentioned there was bad blood between them, which was great because we didn't know each other well yet. However, once we were engaged, I wanted to learn more about her family and what I was getting into. Her mother, the professor, worked at a college teaching a subject I would most likely never study. My wife portrayed her father, Phil, as a weak man who would do whatever the professor desired. Some of the details she told me about her mother's actions seemed ludicrous and borderline psychotic. For example, in middle school, the professor tried to obtain my wife a girlfriend by claiming she was a lesbian. Now, while my wife is a tomboy, she is not a lesbian. There was also a time when the professor desired to live a natural lifestyle, and begged Phil's brother to allow them to reside on his property. Within a week, the professor despised it and summoned them both back to the city. My wife, on the other hand, adored the farm and felt a connection to both it and her uncle. She left home at 16 and stayed with her uncle until she was 18. The professor repeatedly threatened to drag her back home, but never followed through. After turning 18, my wife went to school, received a 4-year degree, and tried an office job but found it unsatisfactory. She began traveling the bus to rural locations in search of suitable work, and this is how we met. Last year, around March, we began receiving mail addressed to the professor and Phil, including bills, bank statements, and the like. I thought this was unusual, but my wife wanted to throw it all away. I began labeling the letters "Return to Sender" and "No Such Occupant," and returned them to the mailbox. This situation worsened in October. I was tidying up the yard when a brilliant white SUV arrived with a U-Haul trailer attached. My wife looked up and turned pale. "Oh God, it's them," she exclaimed. A plump woman and a slender man, who only distantly resembled her uncle, emerged. The professor instantly approached my wife. "Professor. Well, let me take a look at you. It has been years." The wife: "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Your instructor. The university is doing virtual classes, and with COVID, we figured we could self-isolate at our ranch." She placed an unusual emphasis on the word "our." "You. Excuse me, but this isn't your ranch." "Professor. I'm confident we can resolve the ownership issue. Aren't you going to invite us in?" "Me? Ma'am, you might be my wife's mother, but you're a stranger to me. I would rather not." The professor turned to Phil. "Professor. Make the call." Phil immediately called the cops and began constructing a story about us refusing to let them into the house that they co-owned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was insanely twisted. Fortunately, as I indicated earlier, it is a small town. The sheriff approached, and it was someone I had known for most of my life. The sheriff exemplifies the ethos of a small town constable. He strives to be a peacemaker and peacekeeper first and foremost. He was also aware that the land had been in my family for 3 generations. "Sheriff, please explain. What's this I hear about you selling half your ranch, Duke?" "Me? I did not. These are my wife's parents, and they believe they have a legal claim to my land." "Professor. Not think? We have lived here since February. With tenant laws that means..." "Sheriff, you know. Funny, I don't remember you in town. That quieted the professor for a moment, but then she delved into her purse and drew out a stack of mail, mostly bills and bank statements with our ranch's address on them. Professor. Then how do you explain these? The sheriff took the letters and examined them. Sheriff, you're welcome. Ma'am, these are all marked return to sender. The professor became desperate. Professor. Please, I have not seen my daughter in years. I just want to make sure she is okay. Surely, you can see that she pointed at me, controls her every move. The sheriff rolled his eyes and approached to speak with my wife and me again. He enjoys resolving interpersonal conflicts, but he had never experienced such craziness. Sheriff, you might want to invite them in for coffee and chat for a few minutes. They're your parents. My spouse? If you leave them here, you'll just have to come back in 5 minutes to handle an assault. Sheriff. You can't mean that. They are your family. Look, I'm just heading up the road. Invite them in and talk to them. Wife's eyes flashed with rage. Your wife asked, does this mean you're going to invite your cousin Aaron to Thanksgiving? Aaron, the sheriff's cousin, was now serving an 8-year sentence for a variety of felonies. The sheriff's entire family regarded him a source of disgrace. The sheriff's expression changed after he made that statement. He gave my wife a look like, that bad, huh? And she simply nodded. The sheriff turned back to face the professor and Phil. Sheriff. Okay, they don't want you here. It's best if you don't come back. The two protested briefly before piling back into the SUV and driving away, with the sheriff following behind to verify they were completely off the property. This was my first meeting with the professor and Phil, and it left a lasting impression. Previously, I described how my wife's mother, the professor, made an unusual attempt to grab control of our property back in October. Things became crazier in December. Keep in mind that we reside in a little village approximately an hour from a major city, so we're not completely isolated. Our ranch is approximately 15 minutes from town via farm road. To give you the lay of the land, I stopped in town to grab some supplies, and by the time I finished packing up the truck, the professor tapped me on the shoulder. This time, she truly acted friendly. I decided to be curt. She literally begged me to listen to her for 5 minutes at the neighborhood cafe. I didn't want to set up a scene on Main Street, so I agreed. We sat down, and the lecturer began speaking. She claimed that my wife was always unsure of who she was, and that the professor and Phil only had her best interests in mind. I didn't want to rant or make charges. I was just waiting for the talk to end. Then she explained, your wife saw you coming and wedged herself into my life. I pushed back. I stated that I felt blessed to have her in my life. Professor. What do you mean blessed? Me. Pardon? Professor. You just said blessed. I put my head in my hands and wished it was over. Everyone in the cafe stared at the two of us. With her final sentence, the lecturer projected her voice. My response was, ma'am, if you're trying to win me over, I suggest you stop using vinegar. She huffed at the phrase but then became friendly again. She reached into her purse and took out a flash drive, laying it on the table between us. Professor. Okay, that's all the proof you need. Take a peek, and I guarantee you'll discover the truth. I was dying within, not just from shame, but also from the manner my mother-in-law behaved in front of individuals with whom I do business on a regular basis. They would certainly want to know what had transpired. Like I stated, it's a little town. I took the flash drive and fled. I returned to the property, where my wife was waiting. She could tell something had happened in town by the pissed-off expression on my face. I recounted what had happened while holding up the flash drive. My wife was baffled by it. I wasn't about to plug it into a computer we use on a regular basis, so I hunted through a closet for an old Dell laptop that hadn't been turned on in ages. We charged it, turned it on, and blocked the Wi-Fi, my wife's suggestion. We plugged the flash drive in and discovered heaps of PDFs. I'm still not sure how to convey what was within. It looked like a journal, a college article, or a thesis research, with my wife as the topic. I'm not sure what the aim was, or what the professor was testing on her own flesh and blood. It described her first experiences with toy dump trucks as a child, as well as dressed in overalls during their brief stay with her uncle, all of which were chilly, disconnected and, as my wife described it, clinical. My wife was referred to as the subject throughout. It was odd and I'm still unsure what the point was. My wife was outraged by the PDFs and urged us to burn the drive, which we did in the fire pit. That was the last time we heard from the professor, but my wife believes more will come. First and foremost, I want to mention that my wife is doing well. She's amused rather than terrified or furious, yet I can tell when she feels the need to be protected. We placed a new camera directed straight at the gate, which I'm keeping locked. I noted in the comments that we had a FaceTime contact with my wife's uncle last night to see if we could gain any additional information. Her uncle initially provided brief responses, such as, "Yeah, sounds like her," and "sounds about right." He is a don't speak ill of others type of chap. When I told him about the strange play for the ranch, he eventually revealed additional facts. Whoever predicted she'd do this before with his sheep farm gets a gold star. He stated that the professor was a major reason why he and Phil no longer speak. My wife's uncle's sheep farm was part of a much larger property owned by her grandfather. The grandfather had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter relocated to the East Coast and worked in a high-paying executive position. She is nearing retirement and was the oldest of the siblings. When the grandfather passed away, he divided his property into 3 portions. His daughter gave her half to the uncle for nearly nothing because she did not desire rural property and understood her uncle wanted to keep the farm running. The other son, Phil, retained ownership but granted uncle permission to use it. That was until Phil decided to attend an expensive university and sold his portion of the land to uncle for a good price. Uncle was able to maintain all of grandfather's land intact. Phil dated the professor during his undergraduate years and eventually married her. Uncle only heard bits and pieces because Phil only called around Thanksgiving and birthdays. That was it for many years. A few years later, the professor was in what uncle described as a hipster phase when he learned about the farm. She didn't just show up, Phil asked first. Phil understood rural life, but the professor did not. Uncle portrayed the professor's ideal farm life as waking up to a kale smoothie, digging beets for lunch, and spending the rest of the day in the sun. If you live on a farm or ranch, you know there are plenty of everyday duties. Uncle's farm was largely a sheep farm, but they also had a vegetable garden and a small orchard, which provided enough of work. Uncle went easy on the professor, assigning her only a few tasks such as pruning dead vines in the garden and airing the compost. She took it as an agony. She nearly devastated Uncle's tomato crop that year, forcing him to redo the compost every evening. But the way she grumbled, you'd think she was looking after the entire orchard and all the sheep. She disliked manual labor but was strangely drawn to the concept of a farm. In my experience, joy cannot exist without pain. My wife, on the other hand, took to it right away. She enjoyed checking fences, maintaining the flock, distributing feed and working in the vegetable garden. Uncle mentioned that they had a local butcher who came by on occasion to take a couple lambs, depending on price and demand. The butcher paid the professor a visit once when he was on the farm. The butcher was a black man, which Uncle didn't bother or care about, but the professor made a big deal of welcoming him by shaking his hand and spoke in a sing-song, high-pitched tone. Uncle thought this was weird, so he mentioned it to us. The professor desired the farm but did not want to work it. She wanted to own it on paper and have Uncle and her husband manage it. She even persuaded her husband to fight the sale he had made with Uncle a few years before, in order to gain partial ownership. Of course, this went nowhere. Uncle had to pay a lawyer, but the case never reached court. After that, Uncle and the rest of the family refused to speak with Phil. I was curious, so I asked Uncle why the professor yelled at me when I stated I was blessed to have my wife. He chuckled and added, "Really kicked that hornet's nest, huh?" Then he mentioned that the first night the professor stayed with Uncle, he and his wife cooked dinner. When they sat at the table, Uncle was about to say grace. My wife flushed when he mentioned this. Apparently, this is a humiliating memory for her. The lecturer exclaimed, "This family doesn't say grace." Uncle shrugged. He wanted to be flexible and told her she didn't have to participate if she didn't want to. She tried to push things even farther, demanding that as long as she was in that house, no one would say grace. Uncle stated that this was the first time he had been disrespectful to the professor, and that no guest would tell him what he could and could not do in his own home. I'm not sure why the lecturer believed that individuals in rural areas did not attend church. After hearing about the sheep farm, I will contact a lawyer. We'll see how it goes. I believe I mentioned it in a previous piece, but we live in a tiny town, and my wacky mother-in-law, the professor, has already caused a stir in only 2 appearances, one at our house and another in town. What I appreciate about small communities is that everyone feels like family and looks out for one another. What I detest about small communities is how quickly gossip spread. The sheriff from my initial post is completely on our side. Dan has done his best to explain to everybody who asks that it is not their business. The difficulty is between my wife and me. We attempted to be social in town before COVID. We attended church regularly and took part in potlucks. I hired my neighbor's boys to help out on the ranch numerous times over the summer. We enjoy being social. When the professor created a disturbance at the cafe in December, I could feel the town's attention on me. Nobody knows what happened but they want to. I can feel it. They are too polite to ask, yet not enough to avoid whispering. It's getting to us. The sheriff informed me that last week, the local pastor directly asked him what was going on with my wife and her mother. The sheriff stated that the pastor believed there should be an easy answer. Sheriff caught it in the bud. My wife's statements had a greater impact than we anticipated. The sheriff stated that unless we requested assistance, it was neither his nor the pastor's responsibility. He did remark to the pastor, and I recall how the sheriff put it to me, "They're part of your flock. She," referring to the professor, "is the wolf. Become an excellent shepherd." Despite this, I continue to receive strange looks whenever I am in town. Scenes like the one in December are unusual around here. Any advice? So it eventually occurred. The professor and Phil are in jail. The circumstances are also unusual, but we are relieved that a resolution has been reached. 2 nights ago, the sheriff called us in the middle of the day. My wife picked up, and after a few minutes of conversation, she began chuckling. She told me what the sheriff said. It appears the professor and Phil decided to try to sneak onto our property. Why? I can't predict this woman. The professor decided that instead of attempting to enter the ranch via the farm road, which we can see from our house, she and Phil would park a bit further away and enter our land via a neighbor's property. My neighbor to the east owns a small orchard and is a hobby beekeeper. He doesn't receive much honey each year, but what he does get he shares or sells at the farmer's market. The bees had just begun to pollinate the field chickweed here. The professor evidently stumbled upon his bee boxes, actually bumping into one. The bees start swarming her, and either she or Phil become enraged and kick one of the boxes over. My neighbor has a sensor perimeter around his bee boxes in case of bears, and it went off. He dashed to his bee boxes and saw 2 middle-aged people batting at bees and yelling. My neighbor phoned the authorities, and after about 20 minutes of attempting to burn and hose the bees down, he swiftly filed charges for the destruction of his bee box and trespassing. Apparently, there are additional charges for interrupting and ruining a farm's agricultural capabilities since his bees pollinate his orchard. They left. Both were apparently coated in stings and are currently in county jail. The sheriff stated that the professor is attempting to argue that the area where the bee boxes are located is a public easement and that she has legal access to it. For the time being, however, it is over. Everyone here breathes a great sigh of relief.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.